Welcome to the Thriving Farmer Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kilpatrick. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and celebrate sustainable farming. We believe that you can build a profitable, sustainable farm that gives you true farm freedom. Join us as we talk to farmers, innovators, educators, and entrepreneurs to glean their top takeaways in business and life. Hey, Thriving Farmers, Michael Kilpatrick here. I am here with Ryan Thiessen, who is the owner-operator of Thiessen Tillage Equipment and formerly Creek Shore Farms in St. Catharines, Ontario. Ryan is a farm equipment designer and fabricator specializing in mechanical weed control for vineyards, orchards, and vegetables or other horticulture operations. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So give us a little bit of an overview of your operation.
Yeah, so I started designing farm equipment and developing it commercially about 2 years ago, starting with undercutters and then getting into walk behind, like the Tillmore Power Ox tooling or Old Planet Juniors. Through that, I developed a relationship with Tillmore, and now I'm the Canadian distributor for Tillmore as well as Haas Tools. And so I serve the Canadian market for mechanical weed control tools, and then I also design tools that are used on the Power Ox or vineyards, things like that.
Very cool. Now, before that, you had a farm.
Yeah, so we still have Creek Shore Farms. My wife is taken over now and sort of switched its focus. We ran Creek Shore Farms since 2010, and we were a 4-acre market farm, specializing in CSAs and some farmers markets. We did summer and winter CSA, so we produced pretty near year-round. We had a barn for storage of root crops and things like that. So we would probably have done maybe 120 summer shares, maybe 100 winter shares, and eventually we transitioned out of farmers markets into an on-farm store. And I was sort of through that developing tools for my farm that other farmers liked and wanted to use that were local to me, part of organizations I was a part of, and that kind of turned into the fabricating side of things. Now our farm is transitioning over to a cut flower operation on a small scale, something that both my wife and our 7-year-old daughter can get really excited about together and we'll work on together.
Can you talk to us about when you were running the farm? What were some of the tools that you started to develop for your farm?
So the first tool I had developed was an undercutter or a bed lifter for harvesting root crops. And then I started building cultivator frames for Old Planet Junior tractors that I had for weed control. Those were the two big ones. But we did some other work like modifying a old Massey, the wide pull type seed drill to be a 3-point hitch seed drill. Different things like that. Lots of little things around the farm that we would build and design. Made my own raised bed maker.
Yeah, I remember you posting pictures of that, and the undercutter bars. I remember those coming out, and because there wasn't a really good undercutter bar system for smaller tractors. I mean, there's some bigger ones out there, but when you get down to maybe the 30-35 horsepower, there just wasn't them out there.
Yeah, there's not a lot, and a lot of folks do build their own, but for people that want something pre-made, I was sort of filling that niche market.
All right, so let's talk about weed control. So let's first talk about why should people be killing weeds? I see some people like, well, no, they're plants too. I should just everything grow out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality there's several problems that weeds bring, and I try to understand all the different sides to the argument. But at the end of the day, weeds are always going to win. They're always going to provide competition to the crop that you're wanting to establish. And there's very few crops out there that can properly coexist with some amount of weed control. Take carrots, for instance. You let the weeds get away from you and good luck finding them. The other problem that too many weeds in the field gets into is airflow issues. So usually when I talk to people about why control weeds, it's, in my opinion, it's the most critical pest on the farm to control, because it sets you up. If you can control your weeds for better airflow, so for all your mildews and things like that, you get better control, and less places for pests and things like that to hide. And at the end of the day, if your farm looks good, you'll feel better, and that means something too. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but
It's just that quality of life aspect of seeing a beautiful weed-free farm.
yeah, and that would be sort of the least important reason to do it. But I love looking at a field where the rows look nice and clean. I can see the kale or the
Mm-hmm.
carrots, and you know, we once, so years ago, um, when we first started farming, for whatever reason, we seemed really popular. We won a couple of awards, and we had a French from out of Quebec, a French language cooking show, came to Niagara and went to a bunch of farms and collected stuff, and ended up at our farm to actually film the cooking. And
Okay.
we drove around in our little Ford Ranger pickup truck around the field, and would, pick tomatoes and beans and stuff. But I didn't know anything but weed control back then. And when I look at the video footage now, I'm super embarrassed because there's video footage of us out there, and it's just a sea of weeds, and we're
Yeah.
in there looking for beans. Um, and these kind of things happen, and that's the flip side of it. Actually, it's not just competition and airflow. On I don't often think of this one, but on our farm, I was in charge of planting, field prep, that kind of stuff, and my wife did most of the harvesting. Well,
Mm.
when you have a really weedy field, her life was so difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Even just trying to find the crop later on, is another reason why to kill weeds.
Yeah, yeah, just efficiencies of harvest. I mean, especially if you're trying to mechanicalize, because if you decide to go to like a bean picker or let's say a carrot harvester, you can't have pulling all those weeds into the machine and expect to get a clean crop.
Yeah, yeah, and I would say usually if you're in the mechanical harvesting, hopefully you've nailed down your mechanical cultivation
Yes.
well before that. But often farms, especially at smaller scales, end up with volunteers on the farm. Untrained, unskilled labor coming to help harvest here and there, and trying to train those people how to harvest properly in a clean row is enough of a challenge, let alone trying to train them how to look for things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, so let's talk mechanical cultivation. So, I mean, obviously, there's places out there you can do like a chemical, but why are more farmers every single day steering more toward the mechanical side?
So I'll give you an example here. I've developed a vineyard cultivator. Most of that was actually started by interest from the conventional farming community, farms, all around me. I'm in
Mm-hmm.
Niagara grape growing country, who use herbicides for most of their weed control. But there's a couple issues. One, in our region, Canada fleabane is now a Roundup resistant weed. It's starting to take over vineyards. So chemicals are starting to lose effectiveness. There's consumer pressure. People want to reduce
Mm-hmm.
pesticides, and um, it's usually herbicides that tend to take the biggest sort of consumer frustration level, I would say, even more than insecticides and fungicides. But it's the herbicides that people tend to focus on, I find. So farms are looking at ways to reduce pesticide usage or herbicide usage, we'll say, for environmental reasons, and also at certain stages, um, now I'm more familiar with uh, chemical weed control in a vine or tree setting
Okay.
than I am with a vegetable setting, because I know there's plenty of herbicides that work on a vegetable side of things. I've never used them, but I spent a decade spraying all names of chemicals in grapes and orchards. But there are certain stages of the year when you're getting either at certain types of bud break, where you cannot use chemical weed control in say, a vineyard setting, where you're going to burn off shoots or different problems like that. And so suddenly farmers have lost the tool that they had for weed control. And so they're, turning more towards mechanical. And once you've invested in a mechanical system, if it's starting to work really well, you can sort of think, hey, I'm going to go back and start eliminating some of my other chemical weed control for these other reasons.
So let's talk through the different parts of a cultivation system. Let's say for just vegetables, you're cultivating a field. What's the first tool that you usually come in with?
Oh, that's a broad question. What's the first tool? That so highly depends on what it is you're growing.
What if we take like two examples? Let's say we start with carrots, because I know that's one that people struggle with a lot.
Yeah. So why don't I talk about what we used when we sort of were winding down our farming for what our carrot weed control program was.
Awesome.
So with carrots, and that's the classic, most challenging one that we often talk about. I end up talking about it all day at trade shows. What we would do at the end is we would spend, say, 3 to 4 weeks before planting doing stale seed bedding. So that was either with a tine weeder, with a really shallow depth-controlled rototiller, and that's critical, or with flame weeding. And so whenever we talk about weed control, we're always talking about that top half inch of the soil. We don't want to do weed control before that, and that's especially critical in stale seed bedding. So we're focused for 3 to 4 weeks on really shallow, depth-controlled weed control or flame weeding. And we might even water the open field if it's especially dry. We want those weeds to germinate. So the day we're going to plant, we go through and we stale seed bed one more time.
Okay.
Then we plant right into that stale seed bed. This is going to differ, this next step, depending on everyone else's farm. But for us, it was day 5 after seeding. We have kept it wet. We'll go out there and we'll flame weed.
Okay.
Just right where the row is, that little, 3-4 inch wide band. Just a really quick, fast flame weeding. In our case, then, carrots began germinating on day 6. And by day 13, so 1 week after germination, we have a sandier soil. We could already go in with a finger weeder and sweep setup.
Oh, wow.
And that carried us right through till we had canopy, and we never hand weeded that field one time.
So with that, are you doing any hilling at all about the carrots to try to get rid of the green top?
At that time, we didn't. But if we were still, when we were starting to wind down the farm, was when I was winding up my understanding and interest in mechanical cultivation. So now we would probably swap the finger weeders out on a bi-weekly basis with something like a spider wheel or something. We don't want to hill them with a full-on set of discs.
Yeah.
That's way too much soil movement. But some kind of a spider wheel will function like a disc, but will tend to leave the soil more friable or looser, and it also won't throw nearly as much soil. But that's a really good way to do it. And then you might switch back into fingers a week after, and then that'll remove a little bit of the soil. You're kind of going back and forth that way.
Yeah, just pushing it one way or the other, and just the whole time killing weeds every single pass.
Yep.
All right, so part of that, though, is dependent on the type of soil you have, and you have the lighter sandy soil. So someone in more of a clay setting, do you recommend they change it to a different type of equipment?
So I have less personal experience with really heavy clay soils. Is where I'm usually honest with people. But I deal with a lot of people who do. And mostly what tends to change with them is their timing on things. So the importance with a heavier clay soil is to make sure you're maintaining friability, which would be the looseness of the soil, right in that top layer. But you don't want to pulverize it like you would with a rototiller, because that's going to result in making basically concrete.
Yeah.
So you want tools that will loosen it but not pulverize it. So say for instance with finger weeders, you'll typically use a stiffer finger weeder.
Okay.
But you also might leave a longer period of time from when you transplant to when you actually get in there and do your first finger weeding. So instead of a 5 to 7 day, you might be at a 7 to 10 day after transplanting, because that plant will need to be that much more rigid. Most in-row, we're going to bounce around here, I guess, a little bit, but
Yeah, it's
most
fine.
in-row weed control, so that would be when we talk about the weed control, where the plants are actually growing, relies on the differential in root strength between the crop you want and the weeds that you don't. That's the most important thing. So when you start to upgrade to a stiffer finger weeder, because that's going to punch into the clay a little bit more, you need to have the roots on your plant that much stronger. So you may, in my case of going in on day 13 or 7 days after germination with the finger weeders, you may choose in a clay soil setting to actually go through with a just some kind of between row weed control, whether that be the sweeps or tines or something. Get as close as you can to the crop, to the carrots. Try to break up as much of the soil in the row just with tool pressure, and but not actually go in and finger weed. Although carrots in that stage might survive, say, a tine weeding a little bit better.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, tine weeding. So we've talked more about the fingers, and fingers are basically wheels with like these spokes that stick out, and there's different sizes and different strengths of those.
Yeah, they're typically, so a finger weeder would typically be a rubber fingered wheel, anywhere from 9 to 16 inches in the vegetable world, and it has a steel sort of downward facing spikes underneath it, and the steel spikes are actually what will drive those rubber fingers, and so the tips of the fingers are actually spinning faster than you're driving because of the difference in diameters. And so the finger weeders, some people might look at them and say they're just poking into the soil, but they're actually sort of sliding through the soil and flicking weeds out. Whereas a tine weeder, at the end of the day, you could picture a leaf rake and dragging that through the soil. And most of these tools, any tool that you're using in the row, typically are only effective at what are called the white thread stage weeds, and tine weeders especially, but they are super effective at that stage. So if you have, even if you've planted, if you seeded carrots or something, as soon as those carrots have poked out of the soil, even just a little bit, or even if you're just below, you can go through and tine weed, and typically a lot of your broadleaf weeds are going to be just these little white threads on the soil surface. They won't have put down much in the way of roots, and you'll just, a good way to test is to walk out to your field and just rake your fingers through the soil surface, and you'll see all these look like little white threads in the soil surface. And that's when you need to be getting out there with your weed control, especially with the tine weeding. The neat thing about carrots, and this is why so many people have problems with paper potting them, is by the time you can see the cotyledon in the carrot, that just that first little bit that pops up, your roots in loose enough soil are already an inch to inch and a half long. They just send this taproot straight down before you can see anything else. And that really anchors them for mechanical weed control.
Yeah, I want to stop on something you said there, which is the white thread stage for weeds, because what people don't realize, and why I think so many people have problems with weed control, is that you need to be cultivating before you even see any weeds.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, if you see bare soil, your bare soil should be cultivated every 4 to 6 days to make sure that you're constantly getting rid of those white thread stage. Because if you do, you just won't have to go out there and weed your soil. The cultivation will take care of it.
Well, and sort of when we started farming, way back in the day when we were doing everything with hand hose in our hands, the idea was, well, let's let the weeds grow a little bit more so that they're easier, a little bit more to pull. Feels like we're doing something, right? And that's the philosophy a lot of farmers have. I sit around and hang out with farmers that I know now who have switched to mechanical weed control. And this is the most common thread that we talk about is, when we were first starting, well, they're not quite big enough yet to pull out, right? We really want to feel like we're doing something. And that's absolutely the wrong mentality, but it's the one we all have. So typically, 4 to 6 days, if you can get in that often, great. 7 to 10 is probably okay, depending on how much it's raining.
Mm-hmm.
You're really looking at those windows. But
Mm-hmm.
definitely, if it looks clean and it's been 4 to 5 days and it's going to rain the next day, absolutely get in there. You won't feel like you're doing anything, but man, you really are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, absolutely. And so the tine weeder too, I like, is that's a blind tool. So you can just run that over even the rows of carrots. I mean, we
Yep.
actually use the tine weeder more than anything, just
Yes.
because it's so versatile.
Yep. No, it's a super effective tool. Once your crop is up and out of the ground a little ways, you might start getting tearing from the tines.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at those really small scales, for just going over the whole area, they're a beautiful tool.
All right, so let's also talk more about the walking tractors, or the Planet Junior type, I guess you would call it, because obviously Tilmer has a new one out that's really great. Um, when you're setting up a system like that, what are the different components that you want to have on that setup?
Yeah. Okay. So, the most critical components in a walk behind tractor setup, and we'll just talk generically about any walk behind. And I'm going to include the BCS in this because it's the most common question I get. But I'll touch on a couple of the little problems with the BCS.
Mm-hmm.
So the two most critical components in a walk behind cultivation setup are the hitching point and the gauge wheels at the back. So
Mm-hmm.
in a cultivator specific walk behind tractor like the old Planet Juniors, um, the hitching point where that tool is attached to the tractor is just barely behind the rear axle. And the reason for this is as you're steering down the row, you're not getting any swing or side to side sway at the tooling on the front of the cultivator, and you can get really super close to your crop row because of that. So this is where I'll touch on the BCS. With the BCS, you could do something like tine weeding. It would work very effectively on a BCS.
Mm-hmm.
But with really tight, precise weed control, you have probably a 12-inch transmission behind the rear axle, and then that's where you're hooking up your tooling. So that if you're operating the BCS going down a row and you're getting a little bit too far, let's say to the left, and you want to correct and steer right, when you turn the handle, you actually draw your tooling further left into the row if you make it
Mm-hmm.
worse before it starts to correct back. This is the same problem we have with doing a 3-point hitch cultivation setup on a standard tractor, is you get all that swing on the back as you're steering versus a front mount or belly mount system. So it's doable, but typically you got to leave the tooling with a lot more space between it. It'll be a little bit less effective.
Mm-hmm.
If that's your absolutely only option, um, by all means, it's going to get you further than having nothing. Um, and so then that's sort of the hitching steering part of it. And then in a walk behind setting, we have also the gauge wheels at the back. And they take a number of forms, but in the simplest, they're just typically two discs that ride between the rows. And what they're doing is they're anchoring the back of the tooling so that as you're making these steering changes at the front, the back is just kind of tracking behind that and following along,
Mm-hmm.
keeping the back of the tool anchored as well. If you didn't have them, rocks or just soil pressure might, the tool might end up riding at 5 degrees and kind of going off to the side.
Mm-hmm.
And they're also controlling for depth, which is something that's hard to do by hand, especially when you get a fair bit of tooling on a walk behind tractor.
Mm-hmm.
And depth is, again, absolutely critical in weed control, is controlling your depth. As soon as you go below that half-inch, maybe 1-inch mark, you're starting to bring up new weed seeds and things like that and destroying more of the soil structure.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people are interested in no-till and that kind of stuff, and I have no problem with that. Our focus would be on what I like to call low till, where we don't work the soil or till below, let's say, if we can control well enough, 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch. That's all you need for weed control. And so we're preserving the soil structure below that, but we're also not bringing up new weed seeds in the process.
Absolutely. No, that was a great kind of explanation of that. So, like basket weeders, because I've got some of the baskets for behind the Tillmore. Do you actually recommend running gauge wheels with those as well?
Nope, no, the basket weeders, they'll self-gauge.
Okay.
So typically we don't run fingered weeders, so, or sorry, gauge wheels. So things like disc killers and basket weeders don't really need gauge wheels. Disc killer is kind of a gray area. So basket weeders are a great tool for when you have crops that are really super close together,
hmm
where you conventional tooling like finger weeders or that won't fit. Again, they'll just do an amazing job on white thread stage weeds, and but in a system that can get really accurate, basket weeders are going to do a very good job right up close to the plant, but they're also not going to throw a lot of soil into your plant row. So
Yeah.
they're good for greens, salad greens, stuff like that, where you may have rows at 7-inch spacings, and you can, if you can steer well enough, depending on what you're operating, um, you can get a little 4-inch basket in there and just go for it.
So yes, let's talk a little bit about that because on the baskets, I see people going about an inch and a half. Is that how far you want to be from the row?
So
And
I'll
obviously,
often,
this is a big discussion.
yes. So typically I will sway people towards giving more space in the 4 to 6 inch range.
Okay.
So when you say inch and a half, we would talk about that as a 3-inch
Yeah.
overall space between the baskets. So I'm typically on something like a walk behind tractor, 4 inches is no problem at all. In a larger tractor, depending if it's belly or rear mount, we might be in the 5 to 6 inch range. But and that's for two reasons. One, if let's say you got an old Farmall Super A, you've stuck a basket weeder on, that's pretty common. Their steering boxes have started to get pretty sloppy, and you're
Mm.
kind of going back and forth across the row, so you're not as effective with staying close. But even if your tractor is really good at driving straight and you're very competent, then what you can do with a narrower basket is it's twice as much work, but you're on a tractor, so it's going quick, is you actually run down the bed,
hmm
hugging one side of the row as close as you can stomach, whether that's an inch and a half, 2 inches, 1 inch. You just get right up to that plant. But you're only focused on one side. And
hmm
then when you get to the other end of the row, you spin around and you focus on the opposite side, which from your perspective will still be that same side.
hmm
Um, so that way you can kind of control how close you're getting. And then as your plants start to canopy, the basket weeder remains effective. So if you have only
Yes.
3 inches between your baskets, they're only going to be effective for so long. Whereas if you get to say 5 inches between them, um, you know, as the canopy fleshes out, you're going to have more space between the baskets, and you may then start to move away from the edge of the row, have a tighter double pass, and then eventually eliminate it to just a single pass.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, what you said there absolutely is like so we were running 5 rows 9 inches apart, and I think we had 5 inch baskets between. And so that way, yeah, we were having that 4 inch gap. And so we would run down one side, back up the other with a Super C. And yep, I think that that's the most concentrated you ever see a mechanical cultivation is where you're basically his eye locked onto that row and you're locked onto that basket edge and you're just, very carefully running down the field to make sure that you don't run over those carrots.
for sure.
Yeah. So the other thing, though, if you're doing this with multiple rows, that you have to have those rows planted all exactly the right distance apart.
Yeah. So um, it, to an extent, yes. Typically, you don't always have to plant them at the same time. Let me back up there. So typically, what a lot of people think has to happen is if you're going to cultivate 3 rows at once, that you have to have a system that will actually plant all 3 rows at once. But more importantly, what you need is a system that will mark all 3 rows at
Mm-hmm.
once.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a smaller scale operation, but you want to be cultivating 3 rows at one time, then what you would do is either with a on the back of a tractor or just pushing, or what we did was mount rake. We had markers on the back of our rototiller. We did shallow rototilling, um, and that would draw 3 straight lines that were equidistant apart down the field. Then if you're going through with like let's say a Jang seeder or hand transplanting, as long as you're more or less staying on that groove, then you should be okay for weed control. Basket weeders, you're going to need to be a lot more consistent with how straight you are than say something that's going to be a little more forgiving, like a tine weeder or a finger weeder setup. It depends on what the tooling you have, but typically what we advise people is as long as you're marking all 3 rows at the same time in a 3-row system, then you should be able to cultivate all 3 at the same time.
So let's talk a little bit about flame weeders. I know that's more of a blind, and I guess before we get into flame weeders, let's talk about blind versus more of like I guess it's row-based cultivation.
Yeah.
And we already mentioned some of those tools. We already talked the tine weeders and such.
Yeah, so I mean the main blind tool would be the tine weeder. That's probably the king of blind tools. Pre-germination, the flame weeder would be another blind tool. There's not a lot of other tools on the market that are good for just sweeping the entire bed in one go indiscriminately. And the flip side of that is your typical tools where you see rows and you have tooling designed around a row system that you have to guide and track. But tine weeders and flame weeders would be the only 2 that are really common that you would use for blind cultivation.
And the advantage of that is you can usually go over the field quicker, and it's more of it's early stage usually too. With obviously with flame weeders, it's before the crop has ever germinated, and with the tines, it can be when they're starting to come up. But when they get bigger, you're usually going to switch back to a in row or more of I don't know how to describe other than what would you call
It's a row cultivation system.
row cultivation system. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and typically, except for the equipment itself, you need less specialized, let's say, tractors to run flame weeders and tine weeders. As soon as you get into tractors, when you're doing row type cultivation, you can do it with a standard, Kubota tractor, but it's going to be a lot easier if you're using a tractor that was designed for cultivation, for the visibility you get out of it. Whereas the other ones will work on you could put a tine weeder on the BCS and it's going to be as effective as on anything else.
And so for like mounting on those other tractors, I've seen front mounted. I know at Roxbury Farm, they have a number of implements that are front mounted, but belly mount, I think, is probably the most common for some of those.
Belly mount would be the most common and probably the easiest to use. Front mount, still typically you're on a larger tractor, your visibility is a little tougher. But if you got a front mount, you're probably on a sufficiently large operation. In terms of a 4-wheel tractor, belly mount is the king. You can see what you're doing. Your steering is always, typically where the tooling is mounted, you're always doing about double the steering to your tool movement, so it's super precise. And it's just being able to see what you're doing and react to changes in the field. There's nothing that can compare to a mid-mount system.
Okay, so let's break that down too, because there's a number of older tractors, especially the Farmals and the Alice Chalmers, but then there's also a new category of new cultivation tractors. So break down with us a little bit of the older ones. What are the models out there that work particularly well, and why are people actually starting to move away from them now?
Yeah, so some of the older common models would be the Alice G is the classic one, and you can't even legitimately probably call it a tractor. I have one. I love it. I'm not making fun of it, but it's more. I think what's important to start teaching people is to classify that as a tool carrier. It's not a tractor. It's not designed to run a PTO, things like that. It is designed as a tooling carrier. I met with someone this winter at a trade show who said we got to stop calling it cultivation. We need to start calling it hoeing. It's really what we're doing, and it's a better description. And apparently, it's what they use in Europe to describe what I'm talking about. But that's an aside. So older tractors, the most common ones are going to be your Alice Gs. any of the Farmall series, so whether that's a Cub, an A, Super A, or the 100 series,
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna find there's
We had Super C's, and
or Super C's. That's getting
yeah.
into an even bigger scale than what a lot of people are dealing with. But yeah,
And the
super.
reason we like the Super C's is, and again, I'm not knocking the small ones because they're, I think, more geared toward, again, tool carrier, just cultivation. But the C was large enough that we could cultivate. We could also pull wagons, and we had enough weight there that we weren't afraid of the wagon getting away from us.
Yes, oh for sure. No, that's absolutely true. But you guys were running a fair bit more land than say sub 10-acre guys probably,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm used to talking about old tractors to the guys at sub 10 acres. As soon as you get above 10 acres, there's a lot of new equipment on the market that has a lot of advantages that the
Mm-hmm.
older tractors aren't going to have, and the economies really start to make sense in that case.
So
Um,
talk to us about a few of those new ones out there.
Yeah, so there's a ton of stuff in Europe that's not available here. Um, whether that be Hack or TerraTech. Well, TerraTech is available in the States. Um, but most of these new, what we would call tool carrier tractors, some of the North American made ones would be the Tillmore tractor or
Mm-hmm.
the Tough Built.
Mm-hmm.
And their focus is, again, on less of being a tractor, more being a tool carrier. So they look quite weird. Typically, they'll have a rear mount engine
Mm-hmm.
or underneath you, and they'll have just this big open space between the front and rear wheels. That's purely designed to fit all number of tooling under there. Um, the Tough Built was a really close copy of the G. It has about the same amount of space under the belly that a G would
Mm-hmm.
have. They might have improved it a little bit, which, if I can go back to the old tractors really briefly, um, on these old like Farmall Super A's or the Kubota L245H's, the problem we still have with those is fitting enough modern tooling underneath that belly system in say a 3-row setup for people to actually get an effective cultivation setup out of it. There's just too much in the way with the engine and the oil pan and all that to really fit the amount of tooling you'd want on the 3-row setup. 2-row, 1-row setups aren't an issue on those tractors, but more and more people are looking to say run 3 rows at 15 inches or some variation of that.
Mm-hmm.
And just to get, if you're trying to get finger weeders and tender plant hose under there, I've done it, and it's a bit of a stretch to get it. You really got to spend a good day finessing the equipment to make it fit. There's some tooling coming onto the market that's going to make that easier on the older
Okay.
tractors, um, but it it's tougher on those sort of front or side mount engine tractors that were really designed. I mean, the Farmall Super A would have been designed as a 1-row tractor, maybe a 2-row.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't designed for these high intensity systems we're using now,
Mm-hmm. They were
which is where
designed
these
for cotton, beans, and corn.
corn, that kind of stuff, right? And you might have used it in your personal garden as well, but I mean, space was less of an issue. There are less people trying to grow just an intense amount of stuff on
Mm-hmm.
below 5 acres, and so that's when we get into this new class of equipment, um, where we have a focus on a lot of space under the belly, and it's really improved what we can fit, and the Tough Built has a good amount of space. The Tillmore's really taken that and made just a crazy amount of space under there for what you can put, and there's some European model tractors that have even more space under the belly.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I love about the Tillmore is just how easy it is to take that equipment on and off.
Yes,
I mean,
yeah,
I
that's
still have my shoulders messed up from just yanking those belly mounts off the Super Cs.
yeah. Well, I mean, even on your standard 3-point hitch tractors, right? Trying to line up the
Mm-hmm.
equipment.
Oh gosh.
I mean, there's a number of good manufacturers of what would be called an A-frame quick hitch,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the most amazing things for getting equipment on and off, even more so than like a Land Pride quick hitch because they self-align to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And just getting into a system like that can save so much pain in the long run for hooking up rear mount equipment, and then definitely on belly mount equipment, when you start to get into these systems that are for 3, 4, 5 rows, you might have something that is, weighs 500-600 pounds under there. And man, that is a bear to drag in and out. And even with a couple people. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yes, in the situation of that Tillmore tractor, it has that crane looking thing that's designed to winch the equipment up, and you swing it out to the side, set it down, and you can winch the new one in. If you don't have a system like that, I'd encourage people to find a way to swap your equipment on some kind of a concrete pad somewhere, and then put casters on it. So that you can set it down on wheels and simply roll it out of the way. It's going to save you a lot of pain and frustration,
Mm-hmm.
because it's good to have at least a couple different cultivation setups.
Mm-hmm.
We typically will encourage people to attempt to streamline their systems, to not have too many different systems going on at once. So you don't always want to have like a 2, a 3, a 4, a 6 row setup. Makes a lot of different tooling unless you're at the scale where that makes sense. But
Yeah.
even finding ways to say, like, let's say you had 3 rows at 15-inch spacing, is a very common mechanical system. You can still very easily run a 1, 2, and 3 row system on that. And with the 3, you have all 3. The 2 is just the outside 2, and the 1 is the center. But find ways in your existing setups to simply delete the other rows, whether that's a sweep you just simply
Yep.
attach, that kind of stuff. But finding a way to standardize across the board your row spacings, things like that. So you don't have like 15 and 24-inch, and then there's an 18 for this crop. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it gets really complicated and really expensive. And you really need to be, typically in most places, unless you say on the West Coast where it doesn't rain in summer, you need to be able to cultivate in these really narrow windows, and things need to be ready to go and functional
Mm-hmm.
and working on that day, because you might have one day in a week where it's dried out and sunny enough for you to actually get your cultivation done. And if you're going back and forth from 6 different systems, and you're doing it really slowly, it's not going to be effective. You're going to get frustrated, and you're going to get behind on your weed control and think, well, this isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
Timing is the number one most critical thing, and the biggest mistake that we would see in cultivation is people not paying attention to the timing on these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So 2 points I wanted to bring up is, one, the first farm I actually interned on, gosh, this was back in 2003 or 2004, so quite a while ago. He's trying to do a 5-acre Elliott Coleman style market garden. And so, if you go off Elliott Coleman's spacing, and again, I love his book, there's a ton of great information in there, but there's no standardized system for setting up your rows. There's like, 6 rows of this 4 inches apart, or, 4 rows of this 7 inches apart. And it made cultivation a bear. There's no way to really standardize that. And so then at this farm, he went and got some coaching from Richard Wiswall. And Richard basically said, okay, I'm setting you up with a cub tractor, 3 rows, 15 inches apart, and you're going to standardize everything. And literally, he was able to fire both of us, which was totally fine because we were starting our own farm at that point. It was only supposed to be a 1-year internship anyway, but he did all the cultivate. We placed 2 full-time people on his farm just because he went to mechanical cultivation and standardized everything.
Yep. Well, and Elliott Coleman's books were what inspired me in some ways to get into farming, and they were the sort of the
Mm-hmm.
farming Bible for the first few years there, when there was none of these other books on the market, right? Like,
Yeah.
and his books are still to this day an absolute wealth of information.
Mm-hmm.
But some of these systems,
Yeah.
where you have just, in some cases, you have to, at the end of the day, make a decision. Are you going to optimize your row spacing and your farm for the plants and rely heavily on manual labor or some kind of labor inputs to maintain the weeds? Or are you going to optimize these spacings for your equipment and maybe lose a little bit of the production capacity you could have had
Mm-hmm.
in exchange for saving you time? I use the classic example of, again, I go back to carrots. It's just the easiest one to talk about.
And they're my favorite crop to talk about. So you can talk all day, every day.
Okay, well, my favorite crop to talk about is potatoes, but they're easy to do weed control on.
Yes.
So again, with carrots, when we started farming, we started with kind of a raised bed system. I don't even think Jean Martin had written his book yet about it. It was just what we did,
Yeah.
and some of it came from Elliot Coleman's stuff. And we were growing 5 rows on this bed top that was maybe 24 inches wide. So I'm guessing they were about 5 inches apart, these rows. And yeah, our idea was, we would hand hoe and hand weed. But typically, you're trying to grow, say, fall carrots. So that's a big one-time shot of crop, right? It's not these small succession plantings that get you through the summer. It's, you might have 10, 15, 20 beds of carrots going into the ground all at once. Well, what happened in our system with these 5 rows, and so our 5 rows were on 4-foot centers. So to what you might see in a Jean Martin system.
Yeah.
But we couldn't not keep up with the weed control in those systems. So typically, we might get only a third of the crop actually weeded. It's July, it's August, it's hot, you're tired. There's just way too much happening, and those carrots at the back of the farm, you forget about them. And or you invest 40, 50 hours into weeding these things by hand, and then other things are starting to let go. So when we first started thinking about mechanical weed control, instead of 5 rows on 48-inch centers, we went to 3 rows on 45-inch centers. So we could call it 48-inch centers again to be consistent, but we pretty well just grew 15-inch centers straight across the field. And eventually we modified that for our tractor, but for undercutting. So we had a significant reduction in our production theoretical capacity, but we were able to bring 100% of those carrots to market weed-free, or as weed-free as they needed to be. We actually had more production per acre of what we could actually finish. And that's an example of us sort of looking to scale our farm to our equipment, rather than, we could have grown twice as many carrots in that space, but we didn't have the labor pool to draw on to actually bring them to market, to get them to the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it comes back to what scale you're on. So if you're on a 1/4 acre lot and you're trying to pack everything in, then the Elliott Coleman is a system is, I think, perfect for you. But as you scale, you've got to be able to make more efficient. And that's where you want to standardize everything and go to, as you said, the 15-inch rows.
Yeah. So I would say it's probably somewhere around the 1/2 to 1 acre mark where it starts to really make sense to think about how you're doing it, even if you're just using a wheel hoe. Just standardizing so that you can get that wheel hoe with the 8-inch stirrup blade in between everything is going to get you a lot further than trying to hand hoe or hand weed the whole operation. And just where it's just so discouraging in August.
Well, you have to bring out 16 different tools to the field.
Yeah.
And no one wants to do that. So, and if you're trying to push that off on an employee or just set up an employee for success with that, then they're going to be like, what tool I use here again? And anyway, it's a very complicated SOP. So if you can standardize everything, and literally it's like go through the entire farm with the 8-inch wheel hoe and then come back with the hilling discs on these specific crops, that makes everything so much simpler.
Yeah. So on our farm, we're on a little 2.5 acre parcel here, of which, say, half that is in cultivation. And then we used to rent another just about 3 acres off site. And that 3 acres was where we grew our big crops. It took a lot of space, where we would use the farmhouse and stuff, so like potatoes and sweet potatoes and squash. And our home farm was where we grew all the other stuff that was a lot more intense. And what we did here was we standardized to roughly 15-inch or some multiple of that, so say 30-inch for broccoli, on everything. And then we had an old Planet Junior cultivator, much like the Power Ox now.
Yep.
And we had 2 cultivators for it. We had one that was finger weeders and tender plant hoes.
Yep.
And then we had another one that was just tender plant hose straight across.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, back then it was my 14-year-old cousin working for us. And, this old Planet Junior walked behind, and I just, anything that was small that you could get over top of, you just once a week, you just went over top of pretty near everything. And then anything that was, that setup we had was designed for 15-inch. So when we went to the broccoli and it was a little wider on, the 30-inch, we weren't getting that center section. Well,
Mm-hmm.
just pop the pin, switch over to the one where it's tender plant hose straight across, and now just blast up and down between the rows.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had two fairly simple cultivation setups that did 90 to 95% of the weed control on our farm, at least
Mm-hmm.
on the home section where we had smaller stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, but everything was standardized to fit those two systems.
Yeah, so this year we used the Power Ox and baskets on the back of it, and I basketed the carrots twice, and they were like. Then I spent probably 15 minutes weeding the rest of them by hand, later in that season. So it was, yeah, because you get those systemized. We had 3 rows on a 30-inch bed, so I think it was like 3 rows at 12 inches.
Yep.
Which I would still tighten it up a little bit more. I think like 3 rows that made 10 inches would be better because you start to fall off the edge of the bed right there.
Yeah. I like to keep people at 12 or above myself.
Yeah.
Not to argue with you on the
Well,
podcast.
no, that's totally fine. I'm just because I'm on the 30-inch bed system, so I'm just trying
Yes.
to fit him in on that. So if I were to switch to exactly like an open field setup, absolutely 15
Yes.
inches, and I would do a scatter shoe, so I'm actually seeding 2 rows at once.
Right. And it depends on your scale. When you start to go below 12 inches, you start to limit the available tooling to you.
Correct. Yes, and so
Then
I was.
that's where that number usually comes into line is, and if you can get up to 15, it's just that much more room to breathe. But below 12 is typically where um, you start to limit tooling options. There's still options, but
Mhm.
you're starting to limit some of them.
Well, I can't use the fingers at that scale.
Well, technically at 10 inches, you could use a 9-inch finger weeder.
Okay, it's just going to
I
be.
think they're good down to 8 or something, 8 or
Would you
9
have to
inches.
stagger them though?
Uh,
Because
Well,
that's straight across.
if you had a 3 row, then you would stagger the center row probably back towards you,
Yeah.
and the front 2 rows would be up at the front of the toolbar. So you have to stagger them to actually fit them into the system,
Mm-hmm.
which is again why the Farmalls and the old Kubota L245s have trouble. There's not enough room to stagger all that stuff.
Aha.
Um, but because yeah, so even in a 15-inch row setup, we're typically using 13-inch finger weeders, something like that, and you still have to make sure that the finger weeders, like, they'll totally hit each other if they're side by side. So that center row is usually either right at the front or it's the one that's sticking way back.
Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. So, what are the biggest mistakes that you see in cultivation?
I touched on it earlier. I mean, the main biggest one is that timing thing is
Mm-hmm.
and not taking it seriously. Um, eh, as soon as you see any green, that sheen of green you see in the
Mm-hmm.
field when the weeds have
Mm-hmm.
just come up, you've reduced your effectiveness probably by 30 to 40%. And every day after that, the effectiveness is going to go down even further.
Mm-hmm.
Um, things like, say, a tender plant hoe or some kind of sweep, it can handle a fair bit of growth. Although the bigger the weed are, the more likely it is to replant itself.
Yes, and
Um,
reroute itself.
yeah,
Yeah.
but that in row, that really critical space, um, you have to get in there when you can't see the weeds. As soon as they're up, again, because I talked about that differential between the root strength of the crop you want to keep and the weeds you don't.
Mm-hmm.
And those weeds are going to develop a strong root system very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and then you're
Mm-hmm.
not going to be able to get them out anymore.
Yeah.
Um, the other, and so this is where mechanical weed control, again, it's a timing thing, but it's one of the struggles with it, is cultivating when it's too wet.
Mm.
Um, and so if you have a system, like say here in Niagara, it was raining pretty near all spring last year. We had guys that couldn't even get corn in at all. And so you're sort of in that hoping for these really narrow windows of when you can cultivate. And you're going to have to make a decision at a certain point. Am I going to cultivate this too wet and just get it done because there's no no sun in sight.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as you cultivate in the wet, you're going to do a few things. You're going to start making in a clay soil, it's going to start hardening up, making future cultivations even harder. You're going to plug your tooling up. It's not going to be as effective. In really wet conditions, finger weeders might actually start to damage your crop. It kind of just smears the soil all around things. But those would be the two, would be timing and cultivating when it's too wet, which are kind of almost the same thing. You can take them both back to timing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So who would you say your mentors have been along this journey?
Yeah, so I thought about that one for a little bit, and three came to mind. When I talk about learning how to fabricate and build tooling, it would have to be my father.
Mm-hmm.
He still is a farm equipment mechanic.
Mm-hmm. And I met him at JM's. How many years ago was that? 4?
Yeah, 3 or 4 years. Yeah, he was kind of giving you guys advice there on how to wire that thing up.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And yeah, so he's a self-employed farm equipment mechanic, and so he drives like a UPS parcel type truck to the farms,
Mm-hmm.
and he fixes stuff on site, and he's always been sort of tinkering and building equipment throughout the years. And when I was younger, and I knew nothing about building stuff, he'd always take the time to ask me how I thought it should be made,
Hmm.
and then he would explain to me what I'd done wrong, and we might argue about it for a while. And as time went on, I started to learn things, and we would
Mm-hmm.
still argue, but I started to win some of the arguments. And now it's to the stage in the relationship where we're fairly equal, right? And so we
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
have these really good conversations. But it was him to teach me these things. And the other important thing he taught me was how to put beauty into what you're doing. Um,
Mm.
all too often we might build something and it's just to get it done. But if you ever look at the equipment I've designed, it's got curves and radiuses built into everything. And I really find it's important that your finished product should look beautiful, and you should be proud to put your name onto it.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually laser cut Thiessen into anything I can. Um, and that's sort of an homage back to what he taught me is if you're proud of something, you'll put your name on it. And,
Mm.
you know, I guess it's marketing too, to some extent, but that was when I used to build stuff just for me.
Mm-hmm.
I fixed up this straw chopper one time. It had these thin little plates on it, and then the shaft failed, and these sickle bar knives, we could never find some of them after that. So I had to replace with heavy quarter wall, and I wasn't going to ever sell that thing. We did
Mm-hmm.
eventually, but I put my name into the side of it because I was proud of this
Mm-hmm.
repair job I had done. And so yeah, my dad, he's been one of my biggest mentors. And then I worked for about 10 years on a grape and tender fruit farm.
Mm-hmm.
And the farm manager there, Randy Gillespie, he really taught me about how to, take care of the fields. He taught me how to work.
Mm.
Um, it's one thing working for your parents, and then it's another thing going out in the world and working for someone totally different. And he was really the one that sort of sat my teenage self down and taught me how to work properly. Especially when the 85-year-old lady did a job once that I couldn't finish.
Yes.
We all have that humbling moment in our teenage years.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and really the one person that really got me into this love of cultivation, I have to say, would be Jason Weston,
Mm-hmm.
who a lot of people have probably heard his name. And I would say it's been some years ago now, 2 to 4 years, probably more like 4. And we had gone through just another season where we had just lost the battle with weeds, and it was so frustrating. And I was on one of these Facebook groups, and this guy posted this picture of his farm. It was a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful farm to start with, but he had no weeds on it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about how he hadn't done any hand weeding. And I thought, well, this is crazy. But I started looking into it. It was Jason Weston's farm, and he had
Yeah.
been using mechanical weed control for a few years. And obviously, um, it's not going to be all roses the first few years. You've sort of spent that time building a weed seed bank. So when you see pictures of Jason's farm, he's spent these last few years getting rid of that. And it's going to take time, but just seeing that this was possible on a mixed vegetable operation. So I sort of attribute Thiessen Tillage to where it is, to the inspiration from seeing his farm and seeing what could be done. And then from that point, I just dove right into anything I could learn about cultivation, going to the Midwest Mechanical Field Day. So it must have been at least 4, if not 5 years since I saw Jason's photo.
Yeah.
There's been 3 of those Midwest Field Days. And just learning everything I can, and trying as best I can to help. It started with doing it on my own farm, but also helping all the farmers in the groups that I was a part of in my own area, and helping them learn how to cultivate. And it was almost a lost art for a few years. That started to come back. And yeah, so in terms of mentors, I would say those 3 have really been the biggest in getting me to where I'm at today. There's lots of other people too, but.
And with that, I'd like to stop here and take a quick break. In a moment, we'll be back with Ryan Thiessen from Thiessen Tillage Equipment. If you've been enjoying this episode so far, you're going to want to head over to growingfarmers.com/free resources and download our free resource bundle to help you shave hours off your week and become a thriving farmer. It includes resources such as our 10 winter growing secrets we wish we knew when we started, which is a ebook which talks about the tips and techniques to get better growth in your winter production. We teach things like the simple but counterintuitive principle that trips up most beginning growers, the shape and size of tunnels that are best for winter production, how to prepare beds so they are weed-free and get beautiful, lush stands of crops, what to do about pests like aphids, voles, and slugs, how to fast-track your research to fine-tune your production for your microclimate, and how to pack in more crops for higher yields and profits. So head over to growingfarmers.com/free resources and download your free resource bundle today. And we are back with Ryan Thiessen from Thiessen Equipment. So Ryan, talk to us a little bit about the fabrication process. If someone's interested in starting to do a little bit of their own, how should they get started?
Yeah. So I would say if you're fabricating, let's say with steel, the first thing to do would be to either get yourself a small welder or find someone and just start making scrap. Just start welding and failing. If you have someone who can guide you, that's all the more better. And then just start making things that you need. I mean, that's really how I started, was building things that we needed around the farm. I'm a machinist by trade. I hadn't mentioned that yet. So I spent 12 years working for the local university. I worked for the math and science department, and if a professor needed a scientific apparatus made, it was my job to design it and build it using any material I could get my hands on. So that was a lot of fun, and that gave me my background. But for someone that just is interested in learning how to make things, just make things. It doesn't have to be pretty day one. And you'll get more confidence if you can find people. There are organizations. So in Quebec, there's CAPE, and they get together a few times throughout the year, and they'll actually have a project. So sometimes it's washing machine conversions, sometimes it's undercutters or these fancy field discs, and you don't have to be an expert at anything to do this. You just have to buy in on their material fee, and then they have depending on the scope of the project, it might be a day or several days, and they just get together and make things. And organizations like that are a really great way to learn as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, just make things.
Yeah, I remember I started with a stick welder, which is probably not the best to start with. They're a little bit more challenging.
They can be more challenging, but I would say for most farmers, if at the end of the day your goal is to still be a farmer who wants to make things, a stick welder might be the better way to go, because you're going to find as your skills develop, you're going to want to fix that rusty disc out back, or
Mm-hmm.
you're going to want to weld outside. And for a lot of farmers, that's the only place they could weld is outside. And a stick welder is going to do a lot better with rusty welding, and with outdoor welding than say a fancier MIG welder will be.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, you can pick up a buzz box, which is what you might call a stick
Mm-hmm.
welder, for 50-60 bucks.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
and it's, with a MIG welder you start to need other, you can get
Gas and
gasless
stuff.
MIG welders, but um, the costs go up. But if you're just looking bare bones just to start, yeah, stick welding, that's a pretty good place to start. And if you can master stick welding, you'll probably do really well at MIG when you upgrade to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still actually have one of my first projects, and I keep it in my office on the shelf here. And the reason why is the welds on it are absolutely horrible. And I just, I'm like, you know what? If I can start there, and now I can weld okay. I'm not great. I don't do a lot of it. But if I can start there, and it's one of those things, you know what? You just have to start and you just have to do it.
Yep. Oh, for sure.
So, what are some common mistakes that you see beginners make when fabricating or just starting the weld?
Um, I would say not. I had a hard time thinking about this one. And a few of them I thought would be, the one common one I see the most often is drilling your holes too small.
Hmm.
Um, so a lot of people might think if they're making a hole for a 3/4 inch bolt, that it should be 3/4 inch, and that's almost never the case. You got to make it a 32nd bigger at least, if not a 16th. Especially if you're
Mm-hmm.
learning, a 16th is probably the way to go. um, and just not taking the time to learn the basics, like welding and how to drill holes carefully and properly. There's lots of, I'm assuming it'd be the same in the States, local colleges that might
Mm-hmm.
teach some really basic courses and on how to do things. That's a really great way to get involved. And from a manufacturing standpoint, even like a small scale manufacturer, is another mistake, is trying to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
I don't do everything. In fact, in terms of tools, most people would be surprised to know that in my shop, I pretty well just have a welder, an angle grinder, and a drill press. I do have a cutoff saw as well, but then I always pause and then I say, and a computer. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and with the computer, I'm able to do CAD design.
Okay.
Now, you can take it from as basic as just drawing a flat plate to as advanced as what I do, where I'm building systems and things like this.
Yeah.
But I almost don't even use my drill press anymore. Almost everything I make is getting laser cut in some fashion or another. And that really doesn't start to make a lot of sense until you're at some kind of volume.
Mm-hmm.
Although I used to get single plates cut back when I was farming. It's just so much more precise. But as soon as you attempt to buy all the tools and do everything, you're often not going to be as efficient at it or as good at it. Like, I don't own a brake, and a brake is a tool used to bend or form metal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I send that out because I deal with a company that can do it on a CNC, and it's exact and it's done properly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so pretty well everything that I would make now is all done, drawn on the computer, sent out, and it's all laser flat plate cutting. We even get tubes laser cut. So if we have a tube with holes in it,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's often coming to us all laser cut those holes.
Ah.
And I mean, that's getting into much more advanced manufacturing systems. But at the basics is, if you think you want to do some manufacturing, it doesn't hurt to find a small local shop that you can use for um, some of the things you'd want to do. Even if you're one-offing, there's lots of shops who would love to help you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, Probably the best to do would be to learn to make proper drawings. They don't have
Mm-hmm.
to be fancy, but just proper dimension drawings, even by hand. And that's going to take you a long way towards um, being able to manufacture and fabricate things.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I would pop in two other mistakes I see, and this is because I made them when I started, was not cleaning the metal well enough. and then not understanding how hot welding is and burning myself.
Yes. Yeah, and I guess I keep forgetting about that cleaning, and that's really super important. I typically deal with brand new steel,
Yeah. Yeah.
so I'm not used to that one anymore, I guess. But yes, definitely cleaning all the rust away. You don't have to clean all the mill scale off. That's not as critical. But definitely, if you got some really rusty steel, just take a flap wheel and just clean that up real quick. And then yes, um, definitely be aware of how hot welding is. And even grinding, right? Like you think you're just going to clean
Yeah.
something up and then touch it, man, that is hot. And metal is a very efficient material for heat transfer.
Yeah, and again, I guess to kind of like wrap that all up too is make sure you have the proper safety equipment, the
Yep.
gloves, the eyeglasses, the welding helmet, because you can kill yourself or just maim yourself pretty quickly
Well,
with yeah.
I would add to that hearing protection and a dust mask,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Okay. Yeah.
Grinding and even welding can produce a lot of dust and fumes. And I'm guilty of not always wearing the dust mask every time I should, but it's important.
Mm-hmm.
All that safety gear, and there's lots of great resources online for what you should be doing and wearing, but it doesn't have to be complicated, right? Just
Yeah.
a normal dust mask, like a 3M kind of one, and even some in-ear buds.
Mm-hmm.
Especially grinding with the hearing protection, that is very loud, and grinders make
Mm-hmm.
a lot of noise.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and then cut off saws too, if you have one of the
yes.
yeah. Stainless steel. Do you do anything with stainless steel?
I typically don't do anything with stain. I used to work a lot in stainless steel and aluminum when I worked for the university.
Mm-hmm.
I typically don't use it in anything that I'm building. Um, it's uh, it's a great metal. It tends to be a little harder to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Stainless steel is tough, so it's not hard in terms of like a hardened steel. It's just tough, so it likes to hold together. It's very sticky. It's a weird description for a metal, but when you start cutting it, you realize that it's sticky. Typically, you'll need specialized cutting tools for it.
Okay.
And you can MIG weld stainless. You can probably stick weld it. Nicest would be TIG welding. That's
Mm-hmm.
you got this hot torch, and then you fill it with filler rod. Um, yeah, it's definitely a little bit more challenging of a material to work with, and not always needed in unless you're dealing with food contact. But for cultivator parts, we typically wouldn't use stainless
Yeah.
anywhere. I do have one application where I make stainless pins, but that's just so I don't have to paint them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I outsource those.
Yeah. So let's talk about your marketing. How are you you selling these products you're working on? I know you work closely with Tillmore.
Yeah, so a lot of my marketing would happen naturally through Tillmore. Um, I guess another big part of it for me, independent of Tillmore, would be trade shows and word of mouth are the two biggest
Mm-hmm.
areas of marketing. So I've really focused on trying to create a good product, and then have what we might call advocates,
Mm-hmm.
who are happy with and who are more than willing to share their experiences with it. I haven't spent a lot of money on marketing except for trade shows, which is a good opportunity to meet with new people and old people, and sort of discuss the new tools that are on the market and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
hear their challenges. I was recently at a trade show out in BC, and it's a heavy blueberry growing region. And it was really interesting for me to learn about some of the challenges with blueberry cultivation that
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea about. We have some blueberries, but we just wood chip them. Um, you know,
Yeah.
and there's some issues with roots growing very close to the surface. So it was a really good opportunity for me to learn there as well about where growers are facing challenges.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you can come back and start working on a solution.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about new farmers, because I know you get around and go with trade shows. What do you think is the biggest mistake that you see beginning farmers making?
Biggest mistake I see new farmers making. Um, Probably trying to do too much, I would say. Um, you know, it's sometimes we get this idea that we can handle everything. We can, jump in and do 4 or 5 acres all at once.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that would be one. Not standardizing things, just having stuff all over the place. Um, I thought about this question for a little bit because I was trying to avoid sounding like a broken record, but I immediately went to not managing your weeds. But I'm like, well, we've already talked about that for the whole podcast. And but honestly, if I'm really honest with looking at where we were 10 years ago to what we're able to do now, um, that was really the one thing that crushed us for so many years was not managing our weeds.
Mhm.
And but I was really trying to come up with something else because I felt like a broken record. But that's my honest answer.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other big one, um, and I know you touch on this a lot with other people, but not understanding your market.
Mhm.
um, it's one thing to be able to grow, you know, tons and tons of great, beautiful vegetables. It's a totally another thing to be able to sell them, which was one of our struggles. Was getting people to actually come and buy the product and be excited about it, no matter how great it was. Um, so really, really trying to understand that, and to not just try to grow everything
Mhm.
because you want to, but to try to grow what you will work for your market, and what's priced effectively at your market. If you got someone there growing carrots for 50 cents a bunch, you can be stubborn all day you want and try to get, $3 to $4 a bunch. But if they're not selling, you need to really focus your energy on what's going to work.
Mhm. 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 What encouragement would you go back and give to your new farmer self those first couple of years?
What encouragement? Um, that's a tough question. Yeah, what encouragement would I give to my new farmer self? Just, have I would say have fun with it. Really focus on paying attention to it and managing the farm properly.
Mm.
One of my struggles was always, which is one reason we chose to transition into equipment fabricating, was I think as much as since I've wanted to be a farmer since I was born, I tell people.
Mhm.
But what I had to come and realize was that I love building farm equipment and talking to farmers and finding solutions to problems
Mhm.
even more than I loved farming. And just being honest with myself about that, because as much as I should be out there doing something, there was always something else that I wanted to do, like
Mhm.
build a straw chopper or something, right? And so then I
Mhm.
was missing my timings on things. Um, yeah, just be honest with yourself about where things are going. Don't grow too quickly. That might have been one of our early challenges as well.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think, it also comes up with what I do on a daily basis too, because, it was the change for me was 2015 when I watched my team, well, the people that took over our farm just bankrupt the very cash profitable farm in just 12 months. And that kind of threw me through a huge loop. And it took me a year or so to recover from that, just to watch that and then to realize that, what we had, the management of our farm was something so special. And then like, okay, so we need to be teaching this because yeah, there's times where I want to be outside, messing with the dirt. I'm stuck in
Yeah,
the office. So
that kind of reminds me too. In the same vein, is our farm has gone through a number of transitions over the years, and the biggest one probably was to decide to start shutting down the vegetable side of the operation.
mhm,
Um, and that was a really hard decision, a very emotional decision for me. It felt like I had failed.
mm,
Um, I'm gonna get emotional as I talk here on the podcast because
yeah,
I was the farm. Like we had invested our whole lives,
mhm,
those long days, every hour, every minute of it into the farm,
mhm,
and to hit this spot where we were like, you know what, it's just not working.
mhm,
Um, and we probably could have made it work, but we had this tillage thing coming down the pipe, and we were a little bit tired of fighting for market share. Um, but just understanding that change is okay, and
mhm,
that you haven't lost yourself by doing something different, by giving up one part of that business. um, doesn't mean you failed. It just means you were actually successful enough to figure out how to switch gears.
mhm. Well, I
um,
I, I want to dive into that too because I think people start farming, they think it's, a public service, and it absolutely is, because we need more farmers growing good food, but also need to realize that maybe you're not cut out to be a farmer. Maybe that's just not you. Somebody who joined over our programs a year and a half ago, our small farm university membership, after 18 months, he quit his membership, or I think it was a year. And he said, "Hey guys, you guys run a great program." He said, "What the program allowed me to do is to figure out that I do not want to be a commercial farmer, and I just want to be more of a backyard permaculture homestead."
Yeah.
And I was like, that to me is success. Because if you have established that, you have figured out what you really want to be doing, and you've saved yourselves years of probably pain and hardship.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not saying that, and I think the thing you're doing, Ryan, too, is you're putting out there something that there's so many of us that can't do. You're putting a very vital service into our industry, which you're very uniquely positioned for. So I don't think, yes, those 10 years was tough to kind of shut that aspect of that part down, but that kind of built you for something much greater, to be able to have a huge added impact into the industry.
Oh, for sure. And I have absolutely no regrets about those 10 years and the money we invested into that.
Yeah.
Um, I taught me a lot. We had a lot of really good times, right?
Yeah.
But one thing, and I thought you were going in one direction and you went in another, but made me think of
Yep.
this was you talked about, we think it's a public service growing
Mhm.
food, and in a lot of cases it is. We need great food, but so often, this goes back to the marketing, is we're selling ourselves short at market. We're not
Mhm.
understanding our cost of productions, and we're often stubbornly, farmers are famous, and I'm going to count myself among those, for being
Mhm.
just absolutely rigid and stubborn in our ways, and we're always right. And I
That's
can say that because I was and still am a farmer, so
yes.
I'm not
Yeah.
criticizing other people here. That's me too.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely. Yeah.
but going to market, and there's that balance between attempting to sell food that's really cost effective, and understanding that you need to be making a profit at the end of the day. As much as it's a public service, that shouldn't come at your own expense.
Mhm.
You're still doing a job, and so maybe if you can't grow that certain product for that certain price, you need to again look inside your business and decide, what am I good and efficient at growing? Where am I making the money? And if you really want to grow something below cost, and because you really enjoy it, well, then that's kind of maybe like a hobby part, but don't let that take over the whole business. Don't let that drown
Mhm.
you.
Mhm.
um,
Absolutely.
so yeah.
If you could pick one, what would be your favorite farming tool?
Mm, I'm gonna have to say finger weeders.
Okay.
They're just again, back to just my whole life revolves around weed control. They are just the one single tool that is just so mind-blowingly effective against weeds in the row.
Mhm.
In any situation, like we use them in vineyards now. We have a big 26-inch head,
Mhm.
and finger weeder is super magical. So I'm gonna go with finger weeders.
Mhm. Mhm. All right. So where can people find out more about you and your work?
So you can look up Thiessen Tillage on Facebook. We have some stuff there. My website is still not really up and going. You can go there, but it'll pretty much tell you to go to Tillmore's website, which is where you can find more about my work as well. But to follow me directly would be on the Thiessen Tillage page right now on Facebook.
All right. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. And it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you over the last couple of years and just kind of watching you and your business grow. And thank you so much for what you do for our industry.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have a chat today, Michael.
Absolutely. Hey, Thriving Farmers. Next week on the podcast is Nicole Masters. Now, Nicole is a soil consultant, has written the book For the Love of Soil. And we had a fascinating conversation. I'm always picking these experts' brains on how I can implement what they're talking about in our projects and farms. So we had some good conversations about opening up brand new ground and just in the biology of the 6 different types of livestock that we are farming below the soil surface. So can't wait for you to join me and listen to everything she has to say. She joined me from, just after riding her horse through the snow in Montana. So it's a fascinating interview. Can't wait to share it with you. So there you have it, another episode in the books. So I'd love if you would hop on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a review. Those mean everything to us. We love to hear what you're thinking. If you have a podcast guest that you can recommend, please pop on over to the Thriving Farmer Podcast website and leave us a review. That's thrivingfarmerpodcast.com.